Would you strap yourself into the exact seat of a man who was just violently killed? In April 1968, a British driver answered that exact call. The reluctant substitute replaced a dead legend, sliding into a bizarre, silent turbine machine. The veteran immediately set blistering speeds, but that specific cockpit was soaked in a blood curse. When the chassis hit the wall, there was no fiery explosion. Just a single right wheel folding violently backward into his helmet, crushing his skull, and claiming a second life from the exact same racing team in less than 30 days. May 1968. The Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Turn 1 at Indy is a brutal, high-speed funnel. You enter the corner carrying immense velocity, completely blind to the exit. The thick gray asphalt is heavily rubbered in, highly abrasive, and bounded by a solid, unyielding wall of concrete. The car attacking the corner is the Lotus 56. It does not howl like a traditional piston engine. It emits a high-pitched, terrifying shriek. A gas turbine helicopter engine provides the thrust. The machine enters turn 1 at 163 miles per hour. That equals 262 kilometers per hour. At that specific velocity, aerodynamic downforce and raw mechanical grip are the only forces keeping the vehicle glued to the track. If the car breaks traction, the driver is no longer piloting a machine. The operator becomes a helpless passenger inside a heavy, low-flying missile. The Lotus abruptly loses its grip on the gray asphalt. The chassis snaps violently. The tires lose their bite and begin a devastating, uncontrolled lateral slide. The aerodynamic wedge entirely leaves the racing line. The sliding metal scrubs speed, but not fast enough. The vehicle skids sideways across the track for a staggering distance. 120 meters. 390 feet of completely helpless high-speed sliding. The concrete wall is waiting. The impact is devastating. The right front quarter of the chassis slams directly into the solid concrete barrier at a sharp 45-degree angle. A heavy, sickening, blunt force crack. The immense kinetic energy of the collision does not stop the car dead. Angular momentum forces the heavy machine to bounce violently off the wall. The chassis ricochets, scraping violently along the concrete surface for another 118 meters. Sparks fly in a colossal shower as the metal tears against the rough barrier. Now, slow the footage down. Analyze the absolute terrifying biomechanics of the next fraction of a second. Look inside the cockpit. The highly engineered tubular chassis of the Lotus 56 did its job. It absorbed the catastrophic frontal impact. The central survival cell remained completely intact. The driver's legs are unbroken. The chest is uncrushed. There is not a single significant scratch on the fireproof racing suit. The pilot survived the primary collision with the concrete wall completely unscathed. But physics is a cruel, unpredictable executioner. The extreme force of the angled impact against the wall completely sheared the right front suspension arm. The heavy magnesium wheel rim, still tightly bound in the thick, sticky racing tire, broke clean off the main chassis. But the debris did not fly away into the crowd. The heavy wheel assembly remained fatally tethered to the car by a single, highly flexible component, the steering track rod. When the wheel sheared off at 160 miles per hour, that thick metal rod acted exactly like a heavy industrial whip. The brutal forward momentum of the detached wheel reached the physical limit of the tether. The track rod snapped tight. The lethal mass of rubber and magnesium was instantly yanked backward, reversing its trajectory. The tire pivoted sharply around the tether point. The debris snapped backward like a heavy pendulum, swinging with the full, devastating force of the initial crash. The trajectory of the reversing wheel was horrifyingly precise. The tire swept directly over the low, aerodynamic cowl of the Lotus. the lethal projectile entered the open, completely exposed cockpit. The heavy block of rubber slammed squarely into the driver's helmet. The sheer, blunt force trauma of the strike was absolute. The neck snapped violently backward. The thick fiberglass helmet cracked instantly under the immense, concentrated load. The skull fractured heavily beneath the protective shell. The violent mechanical whiplash of the tire strike instantly shattered the fragile neural pathways. The limp body slumped inside the intact cockpit did not belong to a careless amateur. That destroyed physical frame belonged to a man who was not even supposed to be in America that day, had death not forwarded him a morbid invitation from Germany. April 1968. The international racing community is completely paralyzed. A devastating, invisible shockwave hits the European paddock, and a mechanical failure or a sudden change in the technical rulebook did not trigger it. A biological termination caused the silence. Jim Clark is dead. Jim Clark was not merely a professional driver. The Scottish icon was the absolute, undisputed benchmark of human capability behind a steering wheel. The racing deity served as the untouchable god of the Formula One. When a rookie driver made a mistake on the track, critics did not look at the suspension geometry to find the error. They looked at Clark's lap times to see how a perfect biological entity operated the exact same machinery. Clark was widely considered entirely immune to the standard, lethal mathematical errors of the sport. The champion possessed a supernatural smoothness, an inherent ability to extract maximum velocity without ever stressing the fragile metal components. And then, during a minor, almost irrelevant Formula 2 race in the damp, freezing forests of Hockenheim, Germany, the iconic green and yellow vehicle suddenly left the asphalt. The chassis crashed violently deep into the dense trees. There were no live television cameras to capture the moment. There was no grand spectacle. The most talented, untouchable man on Earth was simply erased in a fraction of a second, leaving behind nothing but scattered debris and a profound, terrifying vacuum. When a god bleeds, the mortals immediately realize their own extreme fragility. If Jim Clark could be killed by a sudden snap of oversteer, absolutely nobody in the paddock was safe. The emotional fallout inside the Lotus headquarters is catastrophic. Colin Chapman, the brilliant, notoriously ruthless founder and chief engineer of the team, is fundamentally broken. Chapman and Clark were not just a standard corporate pairing of boss and employee. The duo operated as two halves of the exact same racing brain. Chapman engineered the cutting-edge, highly fragile weapons, and Clark deployed them with lethal precision. With Clark suddenly gone, the structural foundation of the entire Lotus empire violently cracks. The mastermind lost his primary executioner, but professional motorsport operates as an incredibly cold, unsympathetic industrial machine. The sport does not possess the capacity to pause for human funerals. Lucrative commercial contracts are already signed. Staggering financial sponsorships are permanently locked into place. The Indianapolis 500, the absolute biggest, most lucrative, and most politically important spectacle in global racing, is rapidly approaching on the calendar. Chapman is trapped in a crushing, agonizing logistical nightmare. The grieving founder is drowning in personal sorrow, but the corporate entities backing the operation demand a physical presence. The powerful American tire manufacturers, the petroleum sponsors, the race organizers, they all demand a Lotus car on the starting grid. The corporate machine demands a driver. Chapman has a gaping, highly toxic, empty seat to fill. Analyze the specific dark psychology of an empty racing seat left behind by a fresh fatality. It is not just a vacant piece of molded fiberglass and fireproof fabric. It is a highly superstitious, heavily haunted physical space. Taking that specific seat requires a very rare, deeply pragmatic kind of mental armor. Most sane drivers would look at that empty cockpit, look at the fresh dirt still lingering on the mechanic's boots from the German funeral, and see a rolling tombstone. Chapman picks up the telephone. The team boss does not call a young, arrogant rookie desperately looking for a quick, reckless path to global fame. A rookie would crack instantly under the severe media scrutiny. The engineer needs a veteran, the director needs a stoic. The mastermind dials a man who completely understands the heavy, morbid gravity of the request. The founder calls Mike Spence. Mike Spence, born in 1936, does not fit the standard mold of a flamboyant, media-hungry racing star. The British gentleman does not actively seek the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi. The professional is a classic, deeply traditional driver. The competitor stands as a quiet, working-class soldier of the starting grid. Spence possesses a long, highly complicated history with the Lotus organization. The pilot had driven for the team in the past. The outsider intimately knows the intense, often brutal and highly demanding political environment of Colin Chapman's operation. The veteran is known throughout the garages as the ultimate safe pair of hands. An operator who delivers precise feedback, respects the machinery, and does exactly what is required without demanding the spotlight. When the heavy black telephone rings in England, Spence knows exactly what the trembling voice on the other end is truly asking. Chapman is not simply offering a highly paid drive at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. The grieving owner is asking a friend to carry a crushing, utterly impossible psychological burden. The boss is pleading for someone to replace a ghost. The psychological pressure of this specific assignment is mathematically incalculable. When a racing driver replaces a standard colleague fired for poor performance or sidelined with a broken leg, the newcomer is simply competing against a normal human standard. It is a baseline they can easily measure and attack. But when you step in to replace Jim Clark, immediately after a violent, highly publicized death, you are no longer competing against a human being. You are competing against a newly crowned, universally worshipped martyr. Spence knows the harsh reality of the paddock. Every single motorsport journalist holding a notepad, every single rival mechanic holding a wrench, every single spectator sitting high in the towering American grandstands will look directly at the helmet inside that specific Lotus and consciously, immediately remember that it is the wrong color. The critics will constantly, silently compare every single move Spence makes to a man who can no longer make mistakes. Death permanently froze Clark in absolute perfection. It is a completely unwinnable, highly toxic psychological war. If Spence drives the car slowly, prioritizing personal safety and gathering conservative data, the ruthless critics will immediately whisper that the substitute is entirely unworthy of Clark's elite machinery. The press will call the Brit a coward occupying a king's throne. If the veteran violently pushes the limits of the car, chasing the pole position, and makes a single, minor driving error, the media will absolutely crucify the effort. The journalists will frame a mistake as a direct insult to the fallen legend's immaculate memory. The loyal gentleman is willingly stepping into a highly publicized, perfectly constructed trap of impossible public expectation. The air around the Lotus team is thick with grief, creating a suffocating, heavy environment that would crush a weaker mind before the engine even fired. But look at the raw, uncompromising DNA of a 1960s racing driver. These gladiators operate on a fundamentally different, almost alien frequency of loyalty, duty, and professional ambition. The quiet soldier does not hesitate. The professional does not leverage the tragedy to demand an extortionate salary increase to absorb the extreme psychological risk. The Brit listens to the broken, desperate voice of Colin Chapman, The substitute understands the absolute critical necessity of the Lotus empire to keep moving forward. The racer knows that if an offer is declined, Chapman will be forced to put a less experienced, potentially dangerous driver into an experimental, unproven car. With the quiet, resolute dignity of a career soldier accepting a highly dangerous frontline deployment, Spence accepts the assignment. The traveler packs travel bags in England. The replacement boards allowed commercial transatlantic flight, leaving home behind. The pilot flies directly into the heavy, humid, unfamiliar air of the American Midwest. The outsider walks through the heavy iron gates of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. The driver navigates through the sprawling, chaotic, incredibly noisy gasoline alley. The Englishman ignores the staring eyes and the whispering crowds. The new arrival walks straight toward the dark, solemn garage of Team Lotus. The brave pilot is fully prepared to absorb the crushing, invisible weight of the world's grief. The veteran is fully prepared to sit in the exact physical space stained by a fresh, unhealed tragedy. Spence accepted stepping into the shadow of Jim Clark. But what waited inside the garage in Indianapolis wasn't a normal race car. It was a monster without a gearbox, roaring with the sound of a fighter jet. Walk past the heavy iron gates of the gasoline alley. Step into the dimly lit, tightly guarded workspace of Team Lotus. Look past the mechanics' holding wrenches. Look directly at the physical machine occupying the center of the stained concrete floor. This is the Lotus 56. Do not classify this object as an automobile. Applying standard automotive terminology to this specific chassis is a fundamental engineering miscalculation. It is not a car. It is a highly experimental, low-altitude aerodynamic missile securely bolted to 4 magnesium racing wheels. Colin Chapman, the chief architect and absolute dictator of the Lotus Empire, looked at the standard internal combustion engine and deemed it entirely obsolete. The chief engineer ripped out the heavy steel pistons. The mastermind threw away the camshafts, the valves, and the exhaust headers. The designer eliminated the spark plugs. In the empty space directly behind the driver's spine, the architect dropped in a frightening piece of military aviation hardware. The innovator installed a Pratt and Whitney gas turbine. This highly complex power plant was engineered specifically for industrial applications and fixed-wing aircraft. The engine does not generate forward momentum through a series of violent, isolated explosions contained inside a metal cylinder. The turbine operates on a continuous, uninterrupted cycle of forced atmospheric pressure and highly volatile aviation fuel. Titanium internal turbine blades actively suck in cold oxygen, compress the air to extreme, crushing pressures, mix the flow with raw kerosene, and ignite a continuous, raging internal firestorm. The resulting high-pressure thrust spins a dedicated power turbine at astronomical, mind-bending revolutions per minute. This radical mechanical choice fundamentally alters the entire physical reality of the machine. First, analyze the sheer acoustic horror of the turbine. Professional racing drivers rely heavily on sensory input to survive a high-speed circuit. The loud, percussive roar of a traditional racing V8 is not just a byproduct of combustion. It is vital mechanical telemetry. A driver listens specifically to the pitch of the engine to calculate exact velocity. The pilot feels the heavy, rhythmic vibration through the thin aluminum floorboard to sense the exact moment the rear tires begin to lose their chemical adhesion to the asphalt. The mechanical noise acts as a biological tether to the physics of the track. The Lotus 56 violently severs that tether. When you press the heavy throttle pedal, there is no aggressive roar. There is no heavy vibration shaking the steering column. The machine emits a chilling, high-pitched vacuum shriek. The exhaust sounds exactly like a colossal volume of cold air being sucked rapidly through a narrow metallic tube. It is the sterile, lifeless sound of howling wind. The driver is thrust forward at terrifying speeds in an eerie, unnatural silence, completely robbed of the crucial acoustic feedback the central nervous system desperately needs to process velocity. The operator is flying entirely blind, relying purely on visual cues as the concrete walls blur past the peripheral vision. Second, examine the drivetrain. To harness this immense, continuous aviation thrust, Chapman routed the raw power to all four wheels simultaneously. Four-wheel drive on a fully paved, high-speed oval circuit is an incredibly rare, highly complex engineering choice designed to force the heavy chassis to bite into the abrasive asphalt. But the absolute most radical, terrifying technical omission lies directly in the center of the cramped cockpit. Look down at the narrow footwell. There is no clutch pedal. Look at the right side of the molded fiberglass seat. There is no heavy steel gear lever. The Lotus 56 does not possess a transmission. There is absolutely no gearbox. The staggering rotational force from the aviation turbine transfers directly to the axles. It is a single, uninterrupted surge of violent power from a dead stop all the way up to maximum terminal velocity. Why does the complete absence of a gearbox transform this specific machine into a highly lethal trap? You must dissect the exact physics of cornering at speeds exceeding 250 kilometers per hour. In a traditional, piston-driven race car, the gearbox is not just an instrument for acceleration. The transmission acts as the primary mechanical tool for survival. When a driver approaches a sharp, heavily banked corner at extreme speed, lifting the foot off the throttle pedal and violently downshifting to a lower gear is mandatory. The heavy internal mass of the pistons creates intense mechanical drag. The engine actively fights the forward momentum. This crucial physical action is called engine braking. The friction physically slows the car down milliseconds before the driver even touches the hydraulic brake pedal. More importantly, the action shifts the dynamic weight of the vehicle aggressively forward, pressing the front tires deep into the asphalt, stabilizing the suspension, and allowing the chassis to safely carve through the apex of the corner. The Pratt & Whitney gas turbine possesses absolutely zero engine braking. When you lift your foot off the throttle pedal in the Lotus 56, the internal turbine blades do not immediately stop spinning. The blades carry immense rotational inertia. The continuous thrust does not instantly cut off. The airflow slowly, gradually spools down. The car does not naturally decelerate. The chassis completely freewheels. The wedge coasts at 160 miles per hour, carrying thousands of pounds of kinetic energy with absolutely no internal mechanical resistance holding the momentum back. If a driver makes a microscopic miscalculation on the approach to a corner, entering just a fraction of a second too late or 2 miles per hour too fast, relying on the heavy drag of a piston engine to scrub off the excess velocity is impossible. The pilot must rely entirely, 100%, on the physical friction of the brake pads clamping against the metal rotors. If those brakes overheat, fade, or lock up on the cold gray asphalt, the uninterrupted momentum of the freewheeling turbine will instantly push the heavy chassis completely off the designated racing line. The vehicle will slide helplessly outward. Furthermore, aviation turbine engines suffer from a terrifying mechanical delay known as spool-up time. When a driver presses the gas pedal in a traditional V8, the power delivery is instantaneous. The car leaps forward the exact millisecond the metal throttle body opens. A gas turbine requires time. When you press the pedal, you must wait up to 3 full seconds for the internal blades to compress enough air to generate actual forward thrust. 3 seconds at 160 miles per hour is an absolute eternity. It dictates that the driver must physically press the throttle pedal down while still deep inside the heavy braking zone, anticipating the exact moment power will be needed at the exit of the corner. Piloting this specific machine requires a complete, violent rewiring of a professional driver's central nervous system. Decades of deeply ingrained physical reflexes, the subtle, instinctive modulation of the throttle to balance the chassis mid-corner, the rapid downshifting to transfer weight, all of these highly developed biological survival mechanisms are instantly rendered completely useless. The operator must entirely overwrite deeply ingrained muscle memory. The professional must relearn the fundamental, unforgiving laws of physics while traveling at extreme velocities, sandwiched tightly between rigid concrete walls. The Lotus 56 was brilliant, aerospace-grade engineering. But the machine was entirely too new. And extreme, untested novelty on a high-speed racing circuit always arrives, carrying the heavy metallic scent of blood. Taming an invisible monster is an impossible task. Yet, on a windy May morning, the designated substitute Mike Spence made the entire American racing establishment fall silent. Tuesday, May the 7th, 1968. The Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Look up at the tall flagpoles positioned around the grandstands. The heavy fabric is snapping violently in the air. A harsh, unpredictable wind is howling directly across the flat Midwest landscape. Wind at an oval circuit is never a minor inconvenience. The invisible airflow acts as a physical wall. Crosswinds catch the flat, highly aerodynamic bodies of the race cars and actively push the tires completely off the optimal racing line. Most intelligent drivers look at those bending flagpoles, calculate the severe risk, and decide to stay securely inside the garage. Why risk destroying a fragile, million-dollar machine in unpredictable gusts just for a practice run? But Mike Spence is carrying a completely different, highly toxic mandate. The substitute is operating under the suffocating shadow of a dead legend. The pilot climbs into the designated machine, chassis number 60. The turbine driver rolls out onto the gray, abrasive asphalt. The Englishman has spent the previous weeks absorbing the brutal, silent judgment of the entire racing establishment. The journalists, the rival mechanics, the spectators, they all looked at the cockpit and saw a cheap substitute. The critics waited for the replacement to fail, to crack under the extreme psychological pressure, to prove once and for all that a normal man did not belong in the seat formerly occupied by perfection. The racer presses the heavy throttle pedal. The turbine engine shrieks. The focused driver ignores the aggressive crosswinds violently pushing against the chassis. The veteran executes a flawless, terrifyingly precise run. Look directly at the official timing boards. 169.555 miles per hour, 272 kilometers per hour. Pause and deeply process the exact weight of that specific number. In 1968, that is not merely a fast lap time. That speed acts as a historic, undeniable statement of absolute authority. The lap registers as the second fastest time ever recorded in the entire history of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway up to that exact moment. The Brit did not just qualify the car. The driver mastered the alien, highly complex turbine technology. The outsider grabbed the ghost of a predecessor by the collar and stepped entirely out of the shadow. The professional proved to the skeptical American press, proved to a demanding boss, and proved to himself that an elite, top-tier operator was behind the wheel. The substitute was not a stand-in. The gentleman was a titan in his own right. The pilot brings chassis number 60 slowly back onto the pit lane. The operator kills the turbine. The engine spools down into a quiet hum. The exhausted man unbuckles the restrictive safety harnesses. The veteran pulls the helmet off a sweating head. The immense dose of adrenaline begins to slowly fade from the central nervous system. The intense, suffocating psychological pressure that had been crushing his chest for an entire month is finally gone. The employee did exactly what the contract demanded. The grueling workday is officially over. The hero can walk back to the hotel, grab a cold drink, and sleep like a genuine champion. Look at the large analog clock ticking on the pit wall. It is late in the afternoon. There are exactly 48 minutes left before the track officials wave the final flag and close the circuit for the day. 48 minutes standing between Mike Spence and total safety. 48 minutes until the garages roll down their heavy metal doors. But shift your focus away from the celebrating crew gathered around Chassis 60. Look over at the other side of the Lotus pit. The atmosphere there is completely different. The air feels incredibly tense. The mood is toxic. Teammate Greg Weld is sitting inside a second machine, chassis number 30. Weld is a highly capable, professional driver, but today the American is failing completely. The teammate is running multiple laps, but the timing board remains flat. The second driver cannot force the turbine machine up to a competitive speed. The chassis is miles off the required pace. In professional motorsport, when a race car is slow, a brutal, high-stakes psychological standoff immediately begins. The mechanics look at the telemetry data and silently blame the driver. The crew whispers that the pilot lacks the nerve to hold the throttle open in the crosswinds. The driver looks at the mechanics and aggressively blames the machine. The pilot complains that the suspension geometry is bent, the steering rack is numb, or the turbine is down on power. It is an expensive, stressful blame game. Colin Chapman stands directly in the middle of this standoff. Chapman is a ruthless businessman. The owner cannot afford to have a multi-million-dollar chassis sitting at the absolute bottom of the timing sheets simply because the driver feels intimidated by the wind. But the engineer also cannot afford to ignore a genuine mechanical defect that might kill someone during the actual race. Chapman needs an immediate, objective, and absolute truth. The boss needs a baseline. The manager needs to know exactly what is wrong with chassis number 30. Is it the man, or is the machine fundamentally broken? The boss cannot ask the primitive telemetry computers. The engineer has to ask the human benchmark. The founder turns away from the struggling Greg Weld and walks directly over to Mike Spence. The dictator does not issue a strict corporate command. The manager asks for a professional favor. The leader asks the man who just ran the second fastest lap in history to climb into the slow car, take the suspect chassis out onto the windy track, and diagnose the mechanical problem. Racing drivers are incredibly selfish creatures. Athletes absolutely have to be. Extreme self-preservation and a towering ego serve as the fundamental biological requirements for survival in a lethal sport. If you ask a standard, highly paid prima donna driver to risk a neck in a teammate's broken, unproven car with only 48 minutes left on the clock, what do you think the exact answer will be? The superstar will laugh right in your face. The elite talent will point to a perfectly tuned car, grab a jacket, and walk out of the circuit. Superstars absolutely do not risk their own bones to solve another man's problem. But Mike Spence was not a prima donna. The veteran was an old-school, working-class British gentleman. The pilot possessed a fatal flaw for a professional racing driver: true selflessness. The man was a pure, dedicated team player. The loyal gentleman looked at Colin Chapman. The professional looked at the highly frustrated mechanics. The veteran looked at the struggling Greg Weld. The brave driver did not argue about the clauses in a contract. The Brit did not point out the dangerous, howling crosswinds. The quiet soldier simply nodded his head. Watch this tragic, quiet pivot. The Englishman picks up the helmet just removed. The racer slides the fireproof balaclava back over a sweating face. The substitute walks away from the perfect, dialed-in chassis number 60. The specific car meticulously tuned, the car completely understood, the car that had just delivered a heroic lap time. The pilot walks over to chassis number 30. The fearless driver lowers his body into a completely foreign cockpit. Understand the extreme physical danger of jumping into another man's race car. A racing machine is not a rental sedan. Every single millimeter of the seat mold, the exact brake bias, the steering ratio, the throttle spring tension. It is all customized specifically for one individual body and one specific driving style. Chassis 30 is completely alien to Spence's deeply ingrained muscle memory. Furthermore, the second car is already under heavy suspicion of carrying a severe mechanical defect. The machine acts as a completely unknown, highly dangerous variable. The competitor straps the harnesses tight. The mechanics signal the all clear. The operator engages the starter. The Pratt and Whitney turbine inside chassis 30 begins to whine, spooling up to a terrifying, high-pitched shriek. The turbine driver rolls out of the pit box and heads toward the gray asphalt. The clock on the wall continues to relentlessly tick down the final 48 minutes of the day. Kindness pushed him into that second cockpit, but on a turbine machine completely devoid of a gearbox, if you fail to feel its exact mechanical lag for even a fraction of a second, the concrete will happily finish the job. The high-pitched vacuum shriek of the Pratt and Whitney gas turbine violently shatters the tense atmosphere of the Indianapolis pit lane. The veteran does not hesitate. The substitute rolls chassis number 30 out of the designated pit box and merges aggressively onto the abrasive gray asphalt of the speedway. In professional motorsport, a driver entering an entirely unfamiliar machine typically executes a slow, highly cautious reconnaissance lap. The pilot gently tests the brake pedal. The driver carefully feels the mechanical resistance in the steering column. The operator slowly introduces thermal energy into the cold rubber tires. The focused pilot abandons standard safety protocols. The apex predator is operating as a guided weapon, specifically tasked with hunting down a hidden mechanical defect. The driver treats the machine with absolute, uncompromising aggression from the very first second. The racer instantly pins the throttle pedal directly to the floorboard. The pilot forces the highly suspect, unproven aerodynamic wedge straight up to a terrifying velocity of 163 miles per hour on the initial outlap. The Englishman crosses the historic bricks of the start-finish line, officially beginning lap 2. The brutal, unpredictable Midwestern crosswinds continue to batter the flat, expansive sides of the Lotus chassis. This is not a gentle breeze. The weather acts as an invisible atmospheric wall, actively attempting to physically push the vehicle completely off the optimal racing line. Most drivers would sense the aerodynamic instability and immediately lift off the throttle, prioritizing self-preservation over a practice time. The professional ignores the wind. The fearless competitor keeps his foot firmly planted. The man stares directly ahead as the concrete walls of the straightaway blur into a solid gray tunnel. The machine approaches the rapidly converging entry point of Turn 1. Turn 1 at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway is not merely a corner. The curve is a brutal, entirely unforgiving funnel of extreme kinetic energy. The apex demands absolute, microscopic physical precision from the biological operator. The designated racing line through this specific curve is effectively an invisible, razor-thin tightrope painted over abrasive gray tarmac. You must position the chassis with mathematical perfection before you even physically enter the corner. If the entry trajectory is miscalculated by a single inch, the immutable laws of physics guarantee that the vehicle will strike the solid concrete barrier at the exit. The driver commits to the corner. The operator inputs the precise steering angle his brain dictates. Instantly, the chassis violently breaks traction. The thick racing tires lose their chemical adhesion to the asphalt. The aerodynamic downforce fails. The car snaps aggressively off the optimal racing groove and initiates a fatal, uncontrollable high-speed slide directly toward the outside concrete barrier. Why did it slide? In the immediate chaotic aftermath of a catastrophic high-speed impact, when an experimental, million-dollar piece of aerodynamic weaponry is reduced to twisted metal against a concrete wall, the immediate industrial reflex is to aggressively blame the machinery. The engineers and mechanics desperately want to look at the scattered smoking wreckage and discover a cleanly sheared steel steering column. The crew intensely wants to find a collapsed suspension wishbone, a ruptured hydraulic brake line, or an internal failure within the gas turbine. The garage actively needs the machine to be guilty, because if the mechanical component is guilty, the human driver is absolved, and the engineering department can simply manufacture a stronger replacement part. But the cold, clinical forensic analysis of the Lotus wreckage delivers a terrifying, inescapable verdict. Chassis number 30 was mechanically flawless in the exact milliseconds prior to the violent impact. The steel suspension arms did not snap under the immense cornering load. The highly pressurized hydraulic fluid did not leak. The steering rack did not bind or lock up. The Pratt & Whitney turbine did not suddenly surge with uncommanded power. The vehicle executed exactly what the biological operator commanded it to do. This absolute forensic conclusion forces a deeply uncomfortable, chilling paradox upon the racing establishment. How does a veteran, elite driver, a man possessing the extreme biological capability and sheer nerve to set the second fastest lap in the entire history of the speedway just 45 minutes prior, suddenly commit a fatal amateur driving error? How does elite, world-class driving talent simply evaporate in the middle of a standard, highly mapped corner? To uncover the absolute truth, you must interrogate the specific eyewitnesses. You must analyze the direct testimonies of the track officials standing mere feet away, watching the physical trajectory of the Lotus unfold in real time. But the official statements do not offer immediate, clarifying answers. The reports offer a glaring contradiction that highlights the terrifying reality of the circuit. Enter Walt Myers. Myers serves as a highly seasoned, deeply experienced corner observer permanently stationed at Turn 1. The official's entire professional existence is singularly dedicated to analyzing the exact entry angle and velocity of every single car, committing to that specific curve. As Spence approaches at 163 miles per hour on lap 2, Myers watches the wedge-shaped Lotus initiate the turn. Myers is instantly gripped by a deep, instinctual alarm. The physical trajectory of the vehicle is fundamentally wrong. The angle is so violently, mathematically incorrect that Myers physically reaches over the desk and forcefully activates the yellow track caution lights before the Lotus even begins its fatal slide. Myers states with absolute, unwavering certainty that Spence entered the corner carrying a line that was significantly too high. What is the exact physical reality of a high line at Indianapolis? The track is relatively flat compared to modern, heavily banked superspeedways. If you enter a corner too high, you position the chassis too far away from the inside apex. The driver leaves absolutely zero geographical margin for error on the exit. The centrifugal force generated by a 1,000-pound object traveling at high velocity acts like an invisible hand, constantly and aggressively pulling the machine toward the outside concrete wall. If the vehicle starts the turn high on the banking, physics absolutely guarantees that the tires will physically run out of usable asphalt before the corner naturally ends. The machine will inevitably be sucked directly into the rigid barrier. Myers' testimony paints a vivid picture of a driver wildly out of position, entering far too high. But this official narrative is instantly fractured by the absolute highest authority at the Speedway, Harlan Fengler, the chief steward of the Indianapolis 500. Fengler possesses a completely different physiological profile of Mike Spence's driving technique. Earlier in the month of May, during previous closed practice sessions, Fengler had actually pulled Spence aside in the dark confines of the gasoline alley to issue a stern official warning. Fengler's specific documented complaint? The chief steward firmly warned the British driver that the rookie was consistently entering the high-speed corners too low. A low entry presents a completely different, volatile mechanical hazard. Driving too low means the driver is cutting the apex incredibly aggressively, dropping the inside left tires completely below the designated white racing line and clipping the flat, unbanked concrete apron of the track. This aggressive, unorthodox maneuver severely upsets the delicate aerodynamic balance of the chassis. The action shifts the dynamic vehicle weight violently from side to side, heavily increasing the immediate risk of a sudden, uncontrollable rotational spin. You have the chief steward officially warning the driver about diving too low. You have the veteran corner observer desperately activating the warning lights because the exact same driver was entering too high. This violent contradiction perfectly isolates the terrifying, mathematical reality of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. The optimal racing line is not a wide, forgiving highway. The ideal path operates as a microscopic, razor-thin tightrope painted on an abrasive gray surface. The physical margin between a flawless, record-breaking lap and a fatal, high-speed impact is measured exclusively in millimeters. A fraction of a degree off the mathematical ideal is instantly amplified by the extreme velocity into a lethal event. So, did Mike Spence physically steer the car too high, or did the driver dive too low? The dark, underlying truth of the fatal miscalculation lies entirely within the specific alien machine he was piloting. The fatal flaw was not a sudden, inexplicable lack of professional skill. The fatal error stemmed from a highly toxic mismatch in biological data processing. Spence was forcing a strange, entirely unfamiliar machine to perform at the absolute bleeding edge of physical and aerodynamic limits. To the casual spectator sitting high in the aluminum grandstands, chassis number 30 and chassis number 60 are visually identical. Both vehicles wear the exact same bright sponsor decals. The twins utilize the exact same Pratt & Whitney turbine engine. The cars share the exact same aerodynamic wedge profile. But inside the secretive, highly paranoid, and deeply analytical garages of professional motorsport, no two physical cars are ever truly identical. A formula-grade race car operates as a highly sensitive, bespoke mechanical organism. Greg Weld's chassis was tuned and constructed specifically for Greg Weld. The mechanical setup of a turbine Indy car involves hundreds of microscopic, highly specific variables. The physical tension of the steel springs, the exact mounting angle of the suspension wishbones, the precise camber and caster alignments of the magnesium wheels, the specific aerodynamic drag coefficient created by slight variations in the fiberglass body panels, the exact hydraulic pressure required to actuate the brake calipers. When Spence drove his own car, Chassis 60, his central nervous system had subconsciously mapped every single one of those microscopic variables. The pilot knew exactly how the chassis would physically roll when he adjusted the throttle pedal. The veteran knew exactly how the steering rack would vibrate through calloused hands when the front tires reached their absolute chemical limit of adhesion. The professional possessed perfect, deeply ingrained muscle memory. The driver could push his own car entirely by pure instinct, allowing biological reflexes to react to the mechanical feedback in fractions of a millisecond. But when the substitute climbed into chassis 30, That exact same, highly specialized muscle memory was transported into a completely foreign, fundamentally hostile environment. The veteran attacked Turn 1 at 163 miles per hour, initiating the physical turning sequence exactly as he had done successfully just minutes prior in his own finely tuned car. But Chassis 30 reacted differently. Perhaps the front suspension springs on Weld's car were slightly stiffer, causing the nose to actively resist the turn-in command by a tiny fraction of a degree. Perhaps the aerodynamic balance was shifted slightly rearward, creating a microscopic, imperceptible delay in the front tires biting the cold asphalt. Perhaps the brutal Midwestern crosswinds caught the specific, subtle fiberglass angles of Chassis 30 differently than they caught Chassis 60. That microscopic, entirely invisible discrepancy in mechanical feedback acted as the true executioner. The slight variation caused Spence's highly calibrated brain to misjudge the exact, optimal entry point for Turn 1 by perhaps a single tenth of a second. The driver turned the steering wheel, relying entirely on proven, elite instinct. But the strange, unfamiliar car simply did not obey the physical command exactly the way the neural pathways expected. The physical trajectory instantly skewed. Centrifugal force, magnified exponentially by the extreme 163 mile per hour velocity, immediately took complete control of the sliding chassis. The wide racing tires scrubbed violently against the abrasive gray surface, generating massive clouds of white smoke as the rubber desperately tried to find chemical grip that simply was not there. The entire vehicle was caught in an inescapable physics equation. The car entirely lost mechanical adhesion to the earth. The lateral slide became mathematically and physically irreversible, turning the wedge into a projectile sliding helplessly across the track. The deviation of just a few centimeters pushed the machine violently into the unyielding concrete wall. But that solid barrier did not kill Mike Spence. The entity that delivered the fatal blow was the absolute safest, most mundane component on the entire vehicle: a heavy, black block of vulcanized rubber. The violent kinetic energy entirely dissipates. The scraping sound of torn magnesium grinding against the solid concrete wall finally stops. The high-pitched, deafening shriek of the Pratt and Whitney turbine engine slowly winds down into a low, metallic hum, and then completely dies out. The Indianapolis Motor Speedway falls into a heavy, suffocating silence. The stillness does not offer a peaceful, quiet afternoon. The track echoes with the specific, terrifying quiet that instantly follows a catastrophic physical trauma. Track marshals immediately sprint across the gray asphalt. Heavy boots slap hard against the track surface. Emergency workers carry chemical fire extinguishers, fully expecting the standard, horrifying racing protocol. A ruptured fuel cell, a chemical firestorm, and a frantic, desperate physical extraction. But there is no fire. The volatile aviation fuel did not ignite. The wedge-shaped chassis of the Lotus 56 is severely battered on the right side, completely wedged against the outer barrier. But the wreckage is not a charred, burning tomb. The central, highly engineered tubular survival cell is completely intact. The mechanics rush to the cockpit, expecting to find a highly frustrated driver cursing loudly, unbuckling the safety harnesses, perhaps holding a broken wrist or nursing a fractured collarbone. Instead, the rescuers look down into the narrow aluminum tub and find a man completely slumped forward, utterly motionless against the steering wheel. Look directly at the floorboard of the cramped cockpit. Look at what is missing from the driver's head. The protective fiberglass helmet has been violently separated from Spence. The shell is lying discarded near the pedals. Analyze the physical condition of that specific helmet. The nylon chin strap is completely intact. The safety belt is still securely fastened and tightly buckled. For a racing helmet to be physically removed from a human head while the chin strap remains locked, the blunt force required is almost mathematically impossible to comprehend. The impact was so severe, so concentrated, that it violently deformed the rigid fiberglass shell, crushing the helmet inward just enough to forcefully slip the entire unit directly over the skull. But the most horrifying detail is not the broken fiberglass. The true terror is the visual signature left directly on the white exterior of the shell. There is a thick, unmistakable, deep black smear, perfectly branded across the crown of the helmet. The mark is raw, vulcanized rubber. The stain is the exact, undeniable physical footprint of a racing tire. The right front wheel did not simply graze the pilot as it snapped backward on the suspension tether. The rubber struck the absolute dead center of the protective shell with the full, unmitigated kinetic energy of a 160-mile-per-hour impact. The marshals carefully pull the driver from the broken machine. There are no external lacerations. The chest cavity is not crushed. The legs are perfectly fine. The sophisticated chassis engineering did exactly what Colin Chapman designed it to do. The metal completely protected the human torso from the concrete wall. But the human skull simply cannot withstand a direct projectile strike from a solid mass of rubber and magnesium. The victim remains unresponsive. The athlete falls deeply comatose. The severe neurological trauma is already actively shutting down the central nervous system right there on the asphalt. The wailing siren of the ambulance cuts through the humid Indiana air, rushing desperately toward Methodist Hospital. The emergency room trauma team takes over the moment the stretcher hits the doors. Doctors strip away the fireproof racing suit. Surgeons place the victim under the harsh, blindingly bright surgical lights. The medical staff immediately preps the operating theater for a desperate, highly invasive craniotomy to relieve the fatal swelling inside the shattered skull. But trauma surgeons operate in strict physical reality, not in miracles. When the team examines the sheer extent of the cranial fractures and the internal brain hemorrhaging, the frantic movement in the room stops. The surgical tools are quietly laid back down on the stainless steel trays. The biological damage is entirely catastrophic. The delicate brainstem is irreparably crushed. There is absolutely nothing left for medical science to repair or salvage. The physical body is lying on the table, technically pumping blood through a mechanical ventilator, but the man is already completely gone. The hours drag on in an agonizing, sterile silence. The hospital waiting room is filled with silent mechanics wearing grease-stained Lotus uniforms. Nobody speaks. Nobody asks for updates. The crew just watches the second hand of the wall clock sweep in endless circles. At exactly 9:45 in the evening, the struggling biological systems finally, completely collapse. The heart stops beating. The official time of death is formally recorded on a piece of paper. Shift your focus entirely away from the sterile hospital room. Look directly at the man standing in the dark shadows of the Indianapolis gasoline alley. Look at Colin Chapman. Chapman is a man defined entirely by absolute control. The founder is a brilliant, ruthless engineering dictator. The boss controls the highly complex aerodynamic blueprints, controls the corporate finances, and controls the drivers. The mastermind calculates every single variable and every single pound of fuel. The architect built an empire on mathematical certainty, but the designer cannot engineer a way out of this specific, suffocating psychological nightmare. The invisible weight pressing down on Chapman's chest in that garage is completely unbearable. Look at the calendar. Less than one single month ago, the grieving man was standing in a freezing cemetery in Scotland, burying Jim Clark. The visionary lost a closest personal friend, an absolute greatest asset, and the undeniable soul of the entire racing organization. That loss alone was enough to permanently break the spirit of a normal man. But this second death is entirely different. The tragedy carries a highly specific, toxic poison. The owner looks at the empty garage space where chassis number 30 used to sit. The engineer remembers the exact conversation from just a few hours prior. The manager specifically walked over and asked Mike Spence to get into that car. Spence was done for the day. Spence had secured his own brilliant lap time. Spence was safe. Chapman initiated the request. The boss asked for the favor, and because Spence was a loyal, selfless gentleman, the driver agreed to help. The visionary is instantly crushed by an inescapable wave of personal guilt. The ruthless, calculating businessman completely fractures. The emotional trauma of losing two elite drivers, two close colleagues, in a span of under 30 days entirely destroys all operational capacity. The horrified inventor realizes, with absolute terror, that the brilliant, cutting-edge turbine machines are currently operating as highly efficient execution chambers. The devastated leader walks into the small, cluttered administrative office inside the speedway. The broken man does not yell. The dictator does not throw steel tools across the room. The reaction is far more chilling. It is the absolute, quiet surrender of a completely defeated soul. The engineer looks at Andy Granatelli, the heavyset American partner and primary financial sponsor of the Lotus turbine project. Granatelli has poured millions of dollars into these specific cars. The founder does not hold a long, complex corporate meeting. The boss does not negotiate. The architect simply hands over the entire operation. The grieving owner officially transfers complete operational control of the remaining cars, the mechanics, and the entire multi-million-dollar Indy 500 entry directly to Granatelli. The leader turns his back on the office. The inventor leaves his personal leather briefcase sitting directly on the desk. That briefcase contains highly confidential engineering notes, complex suspension setup calculations, aerodynamic data. It is an entire professional life. The mastermind abandons it. The visionary leaves the paperwork, the tools, and the American racing spectacle behind. The defeated man speaks a quiet, absolute vow to the men in the room. The pioneer will have absolutely nothing to do with the 1968 Indianapolis 500 ever again. The racing titan is entirely finished. The broken soul walks out of the heavy iron gates of the speedway alone. The grieving friend travels to the local airport. The boss does not board a commercial flight celebrating a glorious pole position or a corporate victory. The mourner boards a loud, cold cargo plane. The devastated passenger sits in a dark, vibrating fuselage flying high over the black Atlantic Ocean. The Englishman is returning to the United Kingdom entirely empty-handed, utterly defeated by the brutal physics and the cruel timing of the sport. In the cold cargo hold directly beneath the floorboards sits a heavy sealed wooden casket. The innovator flew to America to conquer the greatest race on Earth with a revolutionary jet engine. Instead, the friend is quietly escorting the body of a man who paid the ultimate bloody price for a simple act of professional kindness. Mike Spence fell in absolute silence. The gentleman did not lose his life to a foolish error. The veteran perished because he chose professional kindness, stepping into another man's unfamiliar machine. His departure hammered a cruel, undeniable curse into that specific Lotus seat, leaving behind an immeasurable grief for the team that remained. The pilot pushed the absolute limits of speed and left a permanent mark on motorsport history. What are your honest thoughts on Mike Spence's tragic final ride and the cruel nature of this fate? Drop a comment below. If you like this video, please subscribe to Terminal Velocity for more stories. Thanks for tuning in, and farewell.